History is full of ghosts. Not the kind that rattle chains, the kind that leave behind empty cities. Imagine walking through streets built for thousands, but the only sound is the wind. Imagine finding temples aligned to stars we no longer watch, filled with writing we cannot read. This has happened. It has happened again and again. We think our own world is permanent. Yeah, we build skyscrapers and digital networks. We plan for the future. But so did they. The Maya built pyramids that touch the clouds. The people of the Indus Valley built cities with plumbing better than some places have today. Then they vanished. Not all at once, maybe. But they faded from history, leaving behind giant question marks made of stone and bone. What happens when a civilization dies? Where do the people go? Why would anyone abandon a city they spent centuries building? Sometimes the clues point to war or disease. Other times the earth itself seems to turn against them, the rain stopping or the rivers turning to dust. And in the strangest cases, there are no clues at all. Just silence. We are still searching for the answers. We dig in the dirt and we scan the earth from space. We are looking for the stories of these lost worlds. We want to know what happened to them. And maybe, just maybe, we want to know if it could happen to us. Number 17, how could a kingdom of millions just walk away? The jungle keeps its secrets. For centuries, the great stone cities of the Maya were hidden beneath a blanket of green. Places like Tikal and Calakmul, with their towering pyramids and sprawling plazas, were just mounds on the forest floor. The people who lived nearby knew about them, but the wider world had forgotten. They had forgotten a civilization that mapped the stars, developed a complex written language, and built a society of millions in the heart of Mesoamerica. The Maya were not a single unified empire. They were a collection of powerful city-states, much like ancient Greece. They flourished for over 1,000 years. Their classical period from around 250 to 900 AD was their peak. They built incredible structures aligned with celestial events. Their mathematicians developed the concept of zero independently. Their calendar was more accurate than the one used in Europe at the time. They were, by any measure, a staggering success. And then, in the southern lowlands, it stopped. Around 900 AD, the engine of their civilization sputtered and died. The great cities were abandoned. The people walked away from the temples and palaces. Construction on monuments ceased. The jungle began its slow work of reclamation. It wasn't an instantaneous event. It was a collapse that unfolded over a century or so. But it was a collapse nonetheless. A society of millions seemed to just dissolve into the forest. The question that has haunted historians and archaeologists ever since is simple: why? For a long time, the leading theories were warfare or disease, and there's evidence for both. The decipherment of Mayan glyphs in the mid-20th century, a process heavily advanced by scholars like Tatiana Proskoryakov, revealed a history filled with conflict. These were not the peaceful stargazers once imagined. They were ruled by powerful kings who waged war on each other constantly. But war had always been a part of Mayan life. It doesn't explain why everyone suddenly left. The disease is also a possibility, but archaeological evidence for a single devastating plague has not been found. The most compelling evidence today points to something more fundamental. It points to the sky. Or rather, the lack of anything coming from it: climate change. Scientists have studied lake sediment cores from the Yucatan Peninsula. These cores act like a historical record, with layers of sediment trapping information about the climate year by year. A team led by geologist David Hodel in the 1990s drilled into the bed of Lake Chichancanab. What they found was stark. The layers corresponding to the period between 800 and 1000 AD showed evidence of intense, prolonged droughts. Not just one dry year, but multiple droughts, some lasting for decades. This was the smoking gun. The Maya were brilliant farmers, but their agriculture was completely dependent on rainfall. They built reservoirs and canals, but even the best engineering can't survive a century of climate catastrophe. The droughts would have led to widespread crop failure. Crop failure leads to famine. Famine leads to civil unrest and disease. The kings and priests, whose authority was based on their supposed ability to communicate with the gods and ensure prosperity, would have lost all credibility. The system fell apart. People likely abandoned the large cities in search of water and food, breaking up into smaller groups, their complex society fracturing under the strain. It was not one single cause, but a domino effect. a death by 1,000 cuts, all started by a change in the weather. The work of archaeologist Arthur Demarest has emphasized this multiplier effect, where drought amplified existing political and social stresses, pushing the system past its breaking point. So the Maya did not disappear in a supernatural sense. Their descendants still live in the region today, speaking Mayan languages. But their great classical civilization, the one that built the giant pyramids, did vanish. It collapsed under its own weight, a weight made unbearable by a sky that refused to rain. They walked away from their cities, not because of a mystery, but because the cities could no longer support them. They chose life in the forest over death in their magnificent stone jungles. But what did that look like for the last people in a place like Tikal? Did the priests and kings who failed to bring the rain face a violent rebellion from their starving people? If their astronomers were so advanced, did they see the long-term climate patterns shifting and know their world was ending? And where exactly did the millions of people go? Did they die in droves from famine and war, or did they successfully disperse into smaller, more sustainable communities, their great history fading into myth? Number 16. What if a city had everything but a past? Imagine a city planned with the precision of a modern suburb. It had straight streets, a sophisticated sewer and drainage system, and multi-story houses made of uniform bricks. This wasn't a city from the 20th century. This was a city that existed over 4,000 years ago. This was Mohenjo-Daro, one of the main centers of the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization. This civilization was enormous. At its peak, around 2500 BC, it covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, stretching across parts of modern-day Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan. They had major urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, and they traded with faraway places like Mesopotamia. They were masters of urban planning. Their cities had granaries, public baths, and a level of social organization that suggests a strong central government. But here is the strange part. For all their sophistication, they left behind almost no record of who they were. We see no grand temples to powerful gods. We find no giant statues of glorious kings. There are no depictions of great battles or conquests. Their cities are incredibly well organized, yet strangely anonymous. It is a civilization without a face, and their biggest mystery is their writing. The Harappans had a written language, a beautiful script made of symbols and signs found on small stone seals. We have thousands of these seals, but no one can read them. The inscriptions are too short, usually only a few characters long. There is no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text to help us crack the code. Scholars like Asko Parpola have spent their entire careers trying to decipher the Indus script, but it remains one of the world's great unsolved linguistic puzzles. Without it, the people of the Indus Valley are silent. We know how they lived, but we don't know what they thought, who they worshipped, or how they were ruled. Then around 1900 BC, their world began to unravel. The great cities started to decline. Trade networks broke down. The uniformity of their culture started to fragment. People began to abandon the urban centers. Within a few centuries, this vast organized civilization had faded away, its cities left to be buried by the sand and soil of the subcontinent. What happened? An early theory, pushed by archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler in the 1940s, was a violent invasion by so-called Aryan tribes. He pointed to skeletons found in the streets of Mohenjo-Daro as evidence of a final massacre. But modern archaeology has largely debunked this. The skeletons show no signs of battle injuries and were not all from the same time period. There is little evidence of widespread warfare or destruction. The more likely culprits are, once again, environmental. The Indus Valley Civilization was a child of its rivers, primarily the mighty Indus and the now mythical Ghaggar-Hakra River. Many scholars believe the Ghaggar-Hakra was the ancient Sarasvati River, celebrated in ancient Hindu texts. But rivers can be fickle, geological and climate shifts can change their course. Research using satellite imagery has shown that the Ghaggar-Hakra began to dry up around the same time the civilization declined. The lifeblood of their agricultural heartland simply vanished. Other studies point to a weakening of the monsoon season. A 2018 study in the journal Climate of the Past analyzed the chemical composition of snails in an ancient lake bed and confirmed a major shift to a drier climate. A weaker monsoon meant less water for crops. For a population of millions, this would have been catastrophic. It's likely that faced with a drying landscape and failing farms, the people of the Indus Valley did what people have always done. They moved They dispersed into smaller villages, adapting to a new, harder way of life. Their grand urban experiment was over. The civilization did not so much disappear as it deurbanized and transformed. But the centralized state, the organized trade, the written language, really all of that was lost. A whole way of knowing the world was forgotten. They left behind a blueprint for a modern city, but no memory of the people who lived in it. Why did a society so advanced and organized leave no monuments to its leaders or its gods? Was their society structured in a way we simply don't understand, perhaps more egalitarian and less focused on individual rulers? What secrets are locked away in their undeciphered script? Could it be simple labels for goods, or does it hold their poetry, their laws, their history? And if their rivers were drying up, did they understand what was happening, or did it seem like the world itself was coming to an end? Number 15, how do you move a mountain with no one left to tell the tale? Easter Island is one of the most remote, inhabited places on Earth, a tiny speck of land in the vast Pacific Ocean, over 2,000 miles from the coast of Chile. It is famous for one thing, the moai, nearly 900 giant stone statues carved in the form of stylized human heads stand guard across the island. Some are over 30 feet tall and weigh more than 80 tons. They were carved from the volcanic rock of a single quarry and then transported somehow for miles across rugged terrain and erected on stone platforms. This incredible feat was accomplished by the Rapa Nui people, Polynesians, who first settled the island around 1200 AD. For centuries, they developed a complex and vibrant culture in complete isolation. The moai were representations of their deified ancestors, and their construction was a central part of their society. The more moai a clan could erect, the greater their prestige and power. But when European explorers first arrived in the 18th century, they found the society in crisis. The island was almost barren. There were very few trees. The population was small and often engaged in conflict. The golden age of moai carving was over. Many of the statues had been toppled. The question was, what had happened to this magnificent culture? How could the people who achieved such an engineering marvel have fallen so low? The most famous theory was put forward by geographer Jared Diamond in his 2005 book, Collapse. He painted a grim picture of ecocide. In his view, the Rapa Nui, in their obsessive quest to build more and bigger moai, cut down all the island's trees. The trees were needed for rollers to move the statues, for building canoes for fishing, and for firewood. Without trees, the soil eroded, crops failed, and the ecosystem collapsed. The society descended into chaos, warfare, and even cannibalism. It became a cautionary tale for the modern world, a story of a society that destroyed itself by recklessly consuming its own resources. This theory was supported by pollen analysis of sediment cores, which showed that the island was once covered in a lush palm forest that disappeared around the time the civilization declined. For decades, this was the accepted story of Easter Island, a story of self-inflicted doom. But in recent years, a more complex picture has emerged. Archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo have challenged the ecocide theory. In their book, The Statues That Walked, they argue that the Rapa Nui were not reckless destroyers, but ingenious survivors. They suggest that the initial deforestation was not caused by humans alone, but also by the Polynesian rat, which arrived with the first settlers and devoured the palm nuts, preventing the forest from regenerating. Furthermore, Hunt and Lipo argue that the Rapa Nui were skilled dryland farmers, using techniques like lithic mulching, enriching the soil with volcanic rocks to grow crops in the poor soil. They also proposed a new theory for how the moai were moved, not by rolling them on logs, but by walking them upright, rocking them back and forth with ropes, much like moving a heavy refrigerator. This method would have required far fewer people and no trees at all. So what caused the collapse? If not ecocide, then what? The real devastation in this revised view came from outside. The arrival of Europeans brought diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis to which the isolated islanders had no immunity. Slave raids in the 1860s carried off a significant portion of the remaining population, including most of the elders who held the knowledge of their culture and the mysterious Rongorongo script, another of the world's undeciphered writing systems. The Rapa Nui civilization didn't commit suicide, it was crippled by contact with the outside world. The debate continues. It's likely a combination of factors: environmental fragility, human impact, and outside contact led to the decline of the old Rapa Nui society. But the image of them as foolish destroyers of their own paradise is being replaced by a more nuanced view of a resilient people who faced unimaginable challenges. They didn't just disappear, They endured. Their descendants are still there today, working to reclaim their history. But we still don't know for sure how they moved the giant statues. Was it walking or rolling or some other method we haven't even considered? What secrets does the Rongorongo script hold about their beliefs in history? And perhaps most hauntingly, when they saw the last tree fall, did they understand the profound and irreversible change that had just happened to their world? Number 14, what if your entire world was a volcano? Imagine living on a vibrant, beautiful island in the Aegean Sea. Your people are sailors, traders, artists. You build magnificent palaces with colorful frescoes depicting scenes of nature and daily life. You have a written language, a powerful navy, and a trade network that stretches from Egypt to mainland Greece. You are the Minoans, and your civilization, centered on the island of Crete, is the dominant power in the region around 1600 BC. The Minoans were Europe's first great Bronze Age civilization. Their palace at Knossos, excavated by the British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, was a sprawling complex of rooms and corridors so intricate it's believed to have inspired the myth of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. But unlike their contemporaries, the Minoans seemed to be a remarkably peaceful people. Their cities had no defensive walls. Their art is filled with images of dolphins, flowers, and athletic festivals like bull leaping, not with scenes of war and conquest. They developed a unique writing system, a script of elegant symbols we call linear A like the Indus script. It remains undeciphered. They were a sophisticated and prosperous people, and then their world was shattered. About 100 miles north of Crete was the island of Thera, now known as Santorini. Thera was home to a massive volcano. Sometime around 1600 BC, it erupted. This was not a normal eruption. It was one of the largest volcanic explosions in human history, many times more powerful than the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. It blew the center of the island of Thera to pieces, leaving the crescent-shaped caldera we see today. The immediate effect would have been apocalyptic. A colossal tsunami, perhaps hundreds of feet high, would have radiated outwards, smashing into the northern coast of Crete. Coastal towns and ships in the harbor would have been obliterated without warning. Then came the ash. A thick blanket of volcanic ash would have fallen over the eastern half of Crete, poisoning the soil, ruining crops, and contaminating water sources. The sun would have been blotted out, leading to a volcanic winter that could have lasted for years, causing widespread famine. For a long time, the Thera eruption was seen as the single event that destroyed the Minoan civilization. It was a clear, dramatic cause for a sudden collapse. The archaeological evidence seemed to fit. Many Minoan sites show a layer of destruction around this time. The civilization that had dominated the Aegean for centuries suddenly went into a steep decline. But the story is more complicated than that. More recent archaeological work has shown that while some Minoan sites were destroyed, many others, particularly in central and western Crete, survived the eruption. Life went on for a while. The eruption was a devastating blow, but it might not have been the knockout punch. It seems to have severely weakened the Minoans, crippling their navy and disrupting their trade. They became vulnerable, and there was another power rising in the Aegean, the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. The Mycenaeans were a more militaristic people. They built fortified citadels, and their art is filled with images of warriors and chariots. Sometime after the Thera eruption, around 1450 BC, the Mycenaeans appear to have taken over Crete. At the Palace of Knossos, the undeciphered Linear A script is replaced by a new script, Linear B and Linear B, which was famously deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952, was found to be an early form of Greek, the language of the Mycenaeans. So, the disappearance of the unique Minoan civilization was likely a two-part tragedy. First, a natural disaster of almost unimaginable scale weakened them critically. Then their opportunistic and more aggressive neighbors moved in and took control. The Minoan culture was absorbed and replaced. Their language, their art, their way of life all faded away. They didn't vanish in a flash of fire and water, but were slowly erased by conquest in the aftermath of a catastrophe. But what was Minoan society really like? Without being able to read Linear A, do we truly understand their religion, their government, or their daily thoughts? Was the eruption a single massive explosion or a series of events that unfolded over months or years, creating a slow-motion apocalypse? And when the Mycenaean warriors arrived in their weakened land, did the Minoans fight back, Or was their peaceful society simply unable to comprehend and resist such organized violence? Number 13, what if your first city was built by a ghost? The story of civilization usually starts with agriculture. People learn to farm, they settle down in villages, and those villages eventually grow into cities. But what if that story is wrong? What if the first great leap forward wasn't a farm, but a temple? In southern Turkey, there is a hill called Göbekli Tepe. For decades, it was thought to be nothing more than a medieval cemetery. But in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began to excavate. What he found would rewrite the very beginning of human history. Buried beneath the hill was a massive temple complex. It consists of dozens of huge T-shaped stone pillars, many of them weighing over 10 tons, arranged in large circles. The pillars are covered in intricate carvings of animals, lions, boars, snakes, and vultures. The truly mind-boggling thing about Göbekli Tepe is its age. It was built around 9,600 BC. That is 11,600 years ago. This makes it 6,000 years older than Stonehenge. It is older than the pyramids of Giza. It is so old that it predates the invention of pottery, writing, and even agriculture. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. This discovery turns everything we thought we knew on its head. It suggests that it wasn't the agricultural revolution that led to complex society and religion. It was the other way around. The immense effort required to build Göbekli Tepe would have required hundreds of people to work together for a long period. They would have needed to be organized, housed, and fed. Schmidt theorized that the need to feed this large workforce may have been the very thing that spurred the invention of farming. The world's first temple may have been the catalyst for the world's first farms. People gathered for religion first, and then figured out how to grow food to sustain those gatherings. Göbekli Tepe was used for about 1,000 years. It was a vibrant religious center for people we know almost nothing about. We don't know their name. We don't know what language they spoke. We don't know the exact meaning of the animal carvings or what rituals they performed among the stone pillars. It is a window into a lost world of belief at the very dawn of our modern era. And then comes the second great mystery of Göbekli Tepe. Around 8,000 BC, the site was abandoned. But the people didn't just walk away. They deliberately buried it. They carefully and purposefully covered the entire complex with tons and tons of earth, creating the artificial hill that preserved it perfectly for 10,000 years. Why? Why would a culture spend centuries building such a magnificent structure only to intentionally bury it? It's one of the greatest puzzles in archaeology. There are many theories. Perhaps their religion changed, and the old temple was seen as taboo or heretical. Perhaps it was a kind of burial, a way of decommissioning a sacred space once it had served its purpose. Some have even suggested that it was buried to protect it from some impending disaster or a hostile new group of people. But there is no evidence of destruction or conflict. The burial seems to have been a careful and deliberate act. The people of Göbekli Tepe did not disappear. They were the ancestors of the farmers and city dwellers who came later. But their culture, their religion, their reason for building this incredible place did disappear. It was a way of life, a worldview that existed for over a millennium and then vanished, leaving behind only these enigmatic stone circles buried under a man-made hill. They built the first monumental architecture in human history, and then they erased it themselves. What did the symbols carved on the pillars mean? Were they representations of gods, shamanic spirits, or tribal totems? What kind of ceremonies took place inside these stone circles, and what profound shift in their culture or beliefs could have led them to decide that the most sacred place in their world needed to be hidden from the sky forever? Was burying it an act of reverence or an act of fear? Number 12, where did the first Americans come from? For much of the 20th century, the story of how people first came to the Americas was straightforward. Around 13,500 years ago, hunter-gatherers from Siberia crossed a land bridge called Beringia, which connected Asia and North America during the last ice age. They moved south through an ice-free corridor that opened up in the massive ice sheets covering Canada. These people, known as the Clovis culture, were identified by their distinctively shaped spear points, found all across North America. They were considered the first Americans. It was a neat, tidy story, but it's a story that has been completely upended. The Clovis first model is no more. The people who disappeared were not a civilization, but an entire theory. The mystery is not what happened to them, but who came before them. The evidence against Clovis first has been building for decades. Archaeologists kept finding sites that seemed to be older. At a site in Monteverde, Chile, archaeologist Tom Dillahay uncovered artifacts including stone tools and preserved animal hides that date back to at least 14,500 years ago, a full 1,000 years before the Clovis people appeared in North America. To get that far south, humans would have had to enter the Americas much, much earlier. Another major blow came from genetics. Studies of the DNA of modern and ancient Native Americans show a complex picture of migration. A 2015 study published in Science by a team led by S.K. Willerslev analyzed the genome of the Anzac child, a Clovis-era infant found in Montana. The study confirmed that Clovis people were direct ancestors to many modern Native Americans, but it also showed that the genetic line split from their Siberian ancestors much earlier than 13,500 years ago. So, if the Clovis people weren't first, who was? And how did they get here? The ice-free corridor would not have been passable much before 13,500 years ago. The most likely alternative is a coastal route. These pre-Clovis people would have been a maritime culture, traveling down the Pacific coast in boats, living off the rich marine resources of the Kelp Highway. This is a difficult theory to prove because the ancient coastlines are now underwater due to sea level rise after the Ice Age. Any coastal settlements are now lost to the sea, but the clues keep piling up. At the Paisley Caves in Oregon, researchers found fossilized human feces coprolites containing human DNA that dates back over 14,000 years. At the Buttermilk Creek Complex in Texas, stone tools have been found buried beneath a Clovis-era layer dating to as far back as 15,500 years ago. The evidence is clear someone was here long before Clovis. This ancient pre-Clovis culture, or perhaps multiple cultures, is a ghost. We have a few of their tools and traces of their DNA, but we don't know who they were. We have no name for them. They were skilled enough to travel thousands of miles into a new continent, adapting to new climates and ecosystems. They were the true first Americans, but their story, their identity has been lost to time. The Clovis culture, once seen as the beginning, was actually just one chapter in a much longer and much more mysterious book. Their distinctive toolkit spread rapidly across the continent, but the people themselves were just one group among many. Why did the Clovis culture's distinctive spear points spread so quickly and widely across the continent around 13,000 years ago? Was it a new technology, a new people, or just a new idea? How did the very first Americans travel down the coast? What kind of boats did they have, and what other evidence of their existence now lies preserved but inaccessible on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean? Number 11. Could you build a city for 20,000 people and leave no name? Just east of the modern city of St. Louis, in the middle of the American Midwest, lie the remnants of a city that was once larger than London. This was Cahokia. At its peak around 1100 AD, it was the largest and most influential urban center of the Mississippian culture, a society of mound builders who flourished in the river valleys of North America. Cahokia was a metropolis. It covered nearly 6 square miles and had a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Its heart was a massive central plaza surrounded by enormous earthen mounds. The largest of these, now called Monk's Mound, is a 4-terraced platform mound that is bigger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was the center of political and religious life, the place where the city's powerful chief ruled. The people of Cahokia were sophisticated engineers and astronomers. They built a series of large wooden circles, now called woodinge, which acted as a solar calendar, marking the solstices and equinoxes. The city was a hub of trade, with goods like copper from the Great Lakes and seashells from the Gulf Coast found among its ruins. It was the first true city in what is now the United States, but by 1350 AD, Cahokia was empty. This bustling, powerful city was completely abandoned. For centuries, its great mounds were just grass-covered hills, their purpose and the identity of their builders a mystery to the European settlers who arrived later. The decline seems to have been rapid. The archaeological record shows a city that went from thriving to deserted in just a couple of generations. The reasons for Cahokia's collapse are still debated, but it was likely a combination of factors, a story we see repeated in many other fallen civilizations. One major theory is environmental degradation. Supporting a large concentrated population would have required vast amounts of timber for construction and fuel, and huge areas of land for farming maize. This would have led to deforestation and soil erosion. Recent studies of lake sediment cores, like those conducted by archaeologist Timothy Pacatat, show evidence of localized flooding and environmental stress around the time of the city's decline. The Cahokians may have exhausted their local resources. There is also evidence of social and political unrest. In the later years of the city, a large defensive wall or palisade was built around the central precinct. This suggests a rising level of fear and conflict, either from outside enemies or from internal strife. The city's hierarchical structure, with a small elite ruling over a large population, may have become unstable. A series of environmental crises, like droughts or floods, could have undermined the authority of the chiefs, leading to social breakdown. Some researchers also point to disease. A large, dense population with poor sanitation would have been a breeding ground for epidemics. But like with the Maya, no definitive evidence of a single killer plague has been found. It's more likely that environmental stress, resource depletion, and political instability created a perfect storm. The city simply became an unhealthy and unsafe place to live. People voted with their feet. They left, dispersing back into smaller, more sustainable communities, leaving their great city to the ghosts. We don't even know what they called their city, or what they called themselves. The name Cahokia is from a different tribe that lived in the area much later. What was the political structure of Cahokia? Was it ruled by a single, godlike chief, or a council of elites? What language did the Cahokians speak? And what were the stories and beliefs that inspired them to build such massive earthen structures? And when the last person left the city, did they turn back for a final look at the Great Mound, knowing that a whole way of life was ending forever? Number 10. How do you lose a Greenland in a world of ice? The Vikings were masters of the sea. In the late 10th century, a Norse explorer named Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland, sailed west and found a vast new land. To attract settlers, he gave it an appealing name, Greenland. Starting in 985 AD, Norse colonists established a thriving society on the southwestern coast of this immense island. For nearly 500 years, the Greenland Norse survived, and for a time, prospered. They built farms and churches, they raised cattle, sheep, and goats. They were Christians, part of medieval European society. They maintained trade with Iceland and Norway, exporting walrus ivory and polar bear skins. At their peak, their population may have reached around 5,000 people, spread across two main settlements, the eastern and western settlements. They were a small but tenacious outpost of Europe on the edge of the Arctic. Then they vanished. Sometime in the 15th century, contact was lost. The last written record from the Greenland colony is a letter describing a wedding in 1408. After that, silence. When a ship from Norway finally arrived a century later, they found only ruins. The farms were abandoned. The churches were empty. The people were gone. What happened to the Greenland Norse? This has been a classic historical mystery. The traditional explanation, popularized again by Jared Diamond in Collapse, is that they were victims of their own stubbornness. They were Europeans who refused to adapt to their new environments. They tried to be ranchers in a place unsuited for it. They refused to learn the hunting techniques of the local Inuit people, who were masters of Arctic survival. When the climate turned colder during the Little Ice Age starting in the 14th century, their way of life became impossible. The growing seasons became shorter. The sea ice choked the fjords, and their pasture land failed. They slowly starved to death, too proud to change their ways. But this story, like the one about Easter Island, is being challenged by new research. Archaeological analysis of Norse garbage heaps, conducted by scholars like Thomas McGovern, shows that in their later years, the Norse were eating a lot more seafood, and their diet shifted from about 20% marine-based to as much as 80% marine-based. This shows they were not stubborn fools, they were adapting, they were hunting seals just like the Inuit. So if they were adapting, what pushed them over the edge? The climate change of the Little Ice Age was certainly a major factor. It made life incredibly difficult, but it might not have been the only thing. The collapse of the walrus ivory market in Europe was another severe blow. African elephant ivory became more available, and the demand for the Norse's main export dried up. This cut off their economic lifeline and their connection to the outside world. Without trade, they couldn't get essential goods like iron and wood. It's also possible they simply decided to leave. As life in Greenland became harder and their connection to Europe weaker, they may have just packed up and returned to Iceland or Norway. A 2014 study of sediment from a lake near a Norse farm suggested that the farmers didn't starve. They gradually abandoned the site. The disappearance might have been a managed withdrawal, not a catastrophic end. There is no evidence of a widespread massacre by the Inuit, although some conflict likely occurred. It's more probable that the population dwindled over decades through a combination of death, disease, and emigration until the last person either left or died. They did not disappear overnight. They just faded away. Did the last Norse settlers intermarry with the Inuit, their DNA and culture blending into the local population? Was there a final organized voyage back to Iceland, a ship of refugees escaping a dying land? Or did the last few families simply grow old and die in their isolated farmsteads, the last speakers of Old Norse in the New World, their stories lost to the Arctic winds? Number 9. Who were the faces in the jade masks? Long before the Maya or the Aztecs, a mysterious civilization emerged in the tropical lowlands of south-central Mexico. We call them the Olmec. Their culture flourished from around 1400 to 400 BC. They are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica because many of their innovations, from pyramid building and ball games to religious concepts, were adopted and adapted by all the great civilizations that came after them. The Olmec left behind some of the most stunning and enigmatic art of the ancient world. Their most famous creations are the colossal heads. 17 of these giant stone heads have been found, carved from volcanic basalt. They can be up to 11 feet tall and weigh as much as 40 tons. Each one has a unique individual face, believed to be portraits of powerful Olmec rulers. The skill and effort required to carve these heads and transport them miles through the jungle from the mountains where the basalt was quarried is astounding. They also created beautiful objects from jade, a material they considered more precious than gold. They made intricate jade masks, figurines, and ceremonial axes. Their art is filled with recurring imagery, particularly the word jaguar, a hybrid human-jaguar creature that was likely a central figure in their religion. They built some of the earliest pyramids in Mesoamerica at centers like La Venta and San Lorenzo. But we know almost nothing about them as a people. We don't know what they called themselves. The name Olmec is an Aztec word meaning rubber people, a reference to the rubber trees in the region. We have not deciphered their system of writing, though there are hints they had one. Their social and political structure remains a mystery. We see the faces of their kings in stone, but we do not know their names or the stories of their reigns. And their end is as mysterious as their beginning. Around 400 BC, their last great center, La Venta, was abandoned. Before they left, it seems they deliberately defaced and buried many of their magnificent monuments, including the colossal heads. The civilization that had laid the foundation for 2,000 years of Mesoamerican culture simply vanished from the historical record. There is no evidence of a foreign invasion. The leading theories for their decline point to environmental factors. The Olmec heartland was a region of rivers and swamps. It's possible that shifts in the river systems, perhaps due to tectonic activity or silting, disrupted their agriculture and transportation networks. Volcanic eruptions in the region could have also coated the land in ash, making it unfarmable for a time. Some scholars, like Richard Deal, have suggested that a combination of these environmental pressures led to internal conflict and social upheaval, causing the population to disperse. The deliberate destruction of their monuments is particularly puzzling. It wasn't a random act of vandalism. It seems to have been a ritualistic act. Perhaps it was done as part of a ruler's death ceremony, or perhaps it was an act of rebellion by a population rising up against their leaders. Whatever the reason, the great Olmec centers were abandoned and their influence faded. Their cultural legacy lived on, but the Olmec people themselves were lost to history. What was the meaning behind the colossal heads? Were they revered portraits of kings, or were they symbols of a hated dynasty toppled and buried after a revolution? Why did they ritualistically destroy their own monuments before leaving their cities? And did the Olmec language and identity survive, hidden within one of the many later cultures that built upon their legacy, or was it lost forever? Number 8, what story was told in a river of blood? On the arid northern coast of Peru, a civilization flourished for 800 years, from roughly 100 to 800 AD. They built enormous adobe brick pyramids called huacas that still dominate the landscape. They were masters of irrigation, turning the desert green with a complex network of canals. And they were some of the most gifted artists of the ancient world. They are known as the moche. The moche left behind no written language, but they did leave an incredibly detailed record of their lives, their beliefs, and their rituals. They left it in their pottery. Moche ceramics are renowned for their realism. They created thousands of portrait vessels, pottery shaped like the heads of individuals, showing such detail that we can recognize the same person at different ages. They also painted complex scenes on their pottery, depicting everything from daily life and hunting to intricate myths and terrifying ceremonies. And their ceremonies were terrifying. Moche art and archaeology reveal a society preoccupied with ritual combat and human sacrifice. The discovery of the tomb of the Lord of Sapon in 1987 by archaeologist Walter Alva gave us an unprecedented look into their world. This Moche ruler was buried with immense wealth and accompanied by sacrificed retainers. The other sites, like the Huaca de la Luna, have revealed the remains of dozens of men who were sacrificed, their bodies splayed across the plazas, their throats cut. The Moche believed they had to offer human blood to their gods to ensure the world's stability. For centuries, this civilization dominated the region. Then, around 600 AD, their world started to fall apart. The cause appears to have been, once again, a dramatic shift in climate. Ice cores drilled from Andean glaciers show evidence of a super El Niño event that lasted for decades. First came torrential rains and massive flooding, which would have destroyed their irrigation canals and adobe pyramids, literally washing their world away. This was followed by a long period of intense drought. This climate chaos would have been devastating for a society whose leaders claimed to control the weather through ritual. When the rains wouldn't stop, and then the rains wouldn't start, the people would have lost faith in their rulers. The archaeological record from this period shows evidence of increasing violence and internal conflict. The sacrifices seem to have become more frequent and more desperate as they tried to appease angry gods. It didn't work. The Moche political structure fractured. The large states broke down into smaller warring factions. By 800 AD, the Moche as a distinct cultural entity were gone, their civilization collapsing under the dual pressures of a hostile climate and a violent ideology. Did the Maku rulers truly believe their sacrifices would save their people, or was it a cynical tool to maintain power? How did the individuals chosen for sacrifice face their fate? Were they honored participants or terrified victims? And as their world was torn apart by floods and droughts, did they see it as a failure of their rituals or as a final apocalyptic punishment from their bloodthirsty gods? Number 7, who built a city of tombs in the middle of nowhere? In the heart of the Jordanian desert, hidden within a maze of sandstone canyons, lies the breathtaking city of Petra. Its most famous structure, the treasury, is carved directly into the face of a pink rock cliff. Petra was the capital city of the Nabateans, a civilization of Arab traders who controlled the lucrative incense and spice routes of the ancient world. The Nabateans were masters of water engineering. In one of the driest places on Earth, they built a sophisticated system of dams, cisterns, and channels to capture and store rainwater, allowing a large city to thrive. From around 400 BC to 106 AD, they were a powerful and wealthy kingdom, a crucial link between the East and the Roman Empire. They were skilled merchants, but they were also a people of mystery. They left behind very few written records of their own history or culture. Most of what we know about them comes from Greek and Roman sources. Their most enduring legacy is Petra itself. The city is a vast necropolis, a city of the dead. Most of the magnificent structures carved into the rock are not houses or palaces, but elaborate tombs for their kings and nobles. The Nabateans lived in more modest, freestanding structures, most of which have not survived. Their focus was clearly on the afterlife. In 106 AD, the Nabatean kingdom was peacefully annexed by the Roman Empire. For a while, Petra continued to prosper as part of the Roman province of Arabia. But the world was changing. The Romans began to favor sea routes for trade, bypassing the old desert caravans. Petra's economic importance began to decline. Then, in 363 AD, a major earthquake devastated the city, destroying many of its buildings and crippling its vital water management system. The city was never fully abandoned. People continued to live there for centuries. But it slowly faded from importance. By the time of the Islamic conquest in the 7th century, Petra was a ghost of its former self. It was eventually lost to the Western world, known only to the local Bedouin, until it was rediscovered in 1812 by the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt. The disappearance of the Nabateans was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow decline and assimilation. As their trade routes dried up and their kingdom was absorbed by Rome, they gradually lost their distinct cultural identity. Their language was replaced by Greek and later Arabic. Their unique religion, a blend of Arab and Hellenistic deities, gave way to Christianity and then Islam. The Nabatean people didn't vanish. They simply became part of the other cultures that swept through the region. But their independent civilization, the one that carved a city out of rock, was gone. What were the beliefs that drove the Nabateans to pour so much of their wealth and energy into carving these elaborate tombs? What was the political and social structure of a kingdom that seemed to appear so suddenly in the desert and control such vast wealth? And if we were to find their lost royal archives, would they tell a story of shrewd merchants and engineers, or a history of people who knew their desert world was fragile and fleeting? Number 6, what was the sign of the crescent and the disk? How high in the mountains of Ethiopia, there is a city called Axum. It is home to massive carved stone obelisks, or stelae, the largest single pieces of stone ever erected in the ancient world. These stelae mark the tombs of the rulers of the Aksumite Empire, a powerful kingdom that rose to prominence in the 1st century AD. The Aksumite Empire was a major player on the world stage. It controlled a vast territory in modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, and parts of the Arabian Peninsula. It was a vital link in the trade network connecting the Roman Empire with India. From its port of Adulis on the Red Sea, it exported ivory, gold, and spices. The Aksumites were so powerful that the 3rd century Persian prophet Mani considered them one of the 4 great powers of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. They minted their own coins and developed their own written script, Ge'ez. In the 4th century, the Aksumite king Ezana converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the first Christian kingdoms in the world. For centuries, it was a beacon of Christianity in a region increasingly dominated by Islam. The kingdom was said to be the home of the Ark of the Covenant, a belief still held by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church today. But from the 7th century onwards, the Aksumite Empire began to decline. The rise of Islam and the Arab conquests of the Red Sea region isolated Aksum from its trade partners in the Mediterranean. Its economic power was severed. The kingdom was forced to turn inward, its center of power shifting south into the Ethiopian highlands. The final collapse is shrouded in mystery. Ethiopian traditions speak of a warrior queen named Gudit, or Yodit, who was not Christian and who laid waste to Aksum in the 10th century, burning its churches and destroying its monuments. The archaeological evidence for this period is scarce, but there are signs of destruction. Climate change also seems to have played a role. Studies of sediment in the region suggest a period of environmental degradation, possibly caused by over-farming and deforestation, leading to soil erosion and a decline in agricultural productivity. A weakened economy, religious conflict, and a failing environment likely combined to bring an end to this once great empire. By the late 10th century, the Aksumite kingdom was no more. Its legacy survived in the later Ethiopian empires, but the classical civilization that built the great stelae had vanished. What was the nature of the pre-Christian Aksumite religion, symbolized by the crescent and disk that appears on their early coins? What was the true story of the warrior queen Gudit? Was she a historical figure, a pagan usurper, or a myth created to explain a time of chaos? And what role did environmental collapse play in the decline of a kingdom that had once been a cornerstone of the ancient world? Number 5. How could a forest swallow an empire of stone? In the jungles of Cambodia lies one of the most magnificent religious monuments in the world, Angkor Wat. It is the heart of what was once the capital of the Khmer Empire, a vast and powerful civilization that dominated Southeast Asia for over 600 years, from the 9th to the 15th centuries. The Khmer Empire was a marvel of engineering and artistry. Its capital, Angkor, was not just a collection of temples. It was a sprawling urban complex, a hydraulic city that covered an area the size of modern-day New York City. The Khmer were masters of water management. They built a huge and complex network of canals, reservoirs, and moats. This system allowed them to manage the monsoon rains, irrigate their rice paddies, and support a population of perhaps 750,000 people, making Angkor the largest pre-industrial city in the world. For centuries, Angkor was the center of a wealthy and powerful empire, ruled by a series of god kings who built temple after temple as monuments to their power and devotion. The empire grew rich from agriculture and trade. Then, in the 15th century, it collapsed. The city of Angkor was abandoned, the capital was moved south to the area of modern-day Phnom Penh. The great temples were left to the jungle, which slowly consumed them. For centuries, the story of this great empire was largely forgotten by the outside world. What brought down such a powerful and sophisticated civilization? The traditional explanation focused on the sacking of Angkor in 1431 by the neighboring kingdom of Ayutthaya from Siam, modern Thailand. This was certainly a major blow, but recent research suggests the empire was already in serious trouble. The fall of Angkor was the result of a long decline, not a single event. The key to both the Khmer's success and their failure was their water management system. It was a brilliant but fragile creation, a series of prolonged droughts followed by intense monsoons, as revealed by tree ring studies, would have put immense strain on the system. The droughts would have dried up the reservoirs, and the intense rains would have caused catastrophic flooding and damage to the canals. This climate volatility, documented by Brendan Buckley and his team, would have crippled their agricultural base and undermined the authority of the god kings, who were supposed to ensure harmony between heaven and earth. The intricate water network, once their greatest strength, became a weakness. As it failed, the city could no longer support its massive population. The shift to a maritime trade-based economy in the south also made the inland capital of Angkor less relevant. The move of the capital was a strategic decision, an admission that their old way of life was no longer sustainable. The great city was not so much conquered as it was rationally abandoned. LiDAR light detection and ranging surveys of the Angkor region, conducted by Damian Evans and the Greater Angkor Project, have revealed the true vast extent of the city and its water network, but also its vulnerabilities. The Khmer Empire did not vanish. It transformed and moved. But its magnificent capital, the heart of its civilization for half a millennium, did. Did the Khmer people know their elaborate water system was failing? Could they see the slow, inexorable decay of the engineering that sustained their world? When the king decided to move the capital, was it an orderly relocation or a chaotic flight from a dying city? And what was it like to be one of the last priests tending the sacred fires at Angkor Wat, as the jungle crept ever closer to the temple walls? Number 4, who were the people who lived on the ledges? In the canyons of the American Southwest, tucked into sheer cliff faces, are some of the most spectacular ruins in North America. These are the cliff dwellings of the ancestral Pueblones, a culture that flourished in the Four Corners region of the United States from about 800 to 1300 AD. We used to call them the Anasazi, a Navajo word that means ancient enemies, but the term is no longer preferred. The ancestral Pueblones were master builders and astronomers. They constructed large, multi-story great houses and apartment-like complexes in places like Chaco Canyon in New Mexico and Mesa Verde in Colorado. Their buildings were aligned with solar and lunar cycles. They built roads and irrigation systems. They were settled agricultural people. Their society built around the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash. For several centuries, their culture thrived. Chaco Canyon in particular became a major cultural and religious center. Then, starting in the late 1200s, they began to abandon their homes. Over the course of a few decades, they walked away from the great houses of Chaco and the cliff palaces of Mesa Verde. An entire region, once home to tens of thousands of people, was left empty. The disappearance of the ancestral Pueblones has been a long-standing archaeological puzzle. There is no evidence of a major invasion or a single catastrophic war. The answer seems to lie, once again, in the environment. Tree ring data, a science pioneered in this very region by A.E. Douglas, provides a detailed year-by-year climate record. This data shows that a severe drought, which scientists call the Great Drought, hit the region in the late 13th century and lasted for more than 20 years. For a people so dependent on agriculture in an already arid land, this would have been a catastrophe. Or crop failures would have led to malnutrition and famine. This, in turn, likely led to social unrest and religious turmoil. The ruling elites, who were supposed to ensure prosperity through ceremony, would have lost their authority. The complex society that had built Chaco Canyon fell apart. The people did not vanish. They migrated, they moved south and east to places with more reliable water sources like the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico and the Hopi Mesas in Arizona. Their descendants are the modern Pueblo peoples of today, including the Hopi, Zuni, and the peoples of the Rio Grande Pueblos. Their oral traditions speak of these migrations, so it was not a disappearance, but a dispersal and a transformation. And their great centers were abandoned, but the people and their culture survived by moving. But why did they build their homes in such inaccessible and dangerous cliff locations in the first place? Was it for defense against enemies or for some other social or religious reason? What was the exact nature of the society centered at Chaco Canyon? Was it a state, a pilgrimage center, or something else entirely? And what were the final prophecies or social decisions that led entire communities to undertake the arduous journey of leaving their ancestral homes forever? Number 3. What if you drew a picture of your own end? In a remote corner of northern Australia on the Arnhem Land Plateau, there's an ancient gallery of rock art. For thousands of years, the Aboriginal people of this region have painted on the rock shelters. But one period of art stands out as particularly strange and haunting. It is known as the Bradshaw art or Gwion Gwion. This art is stylistically very different from other Aboriginal art. It depicts graceful, elongated human figures, often adorned with elaborate headdresses, tassels, and sashes. They are shown dancing, hunting, and performing ceremonies. The art is incredibly sophisticated. But the Aboriginal people of the region today say that these paintings were not made by their direct ancestors, but by a different people who were there before them. They say the Bradshaw figures were made by the spirits. The dating of this art has been difficult, but recent techniques suggest it could be at least 12,000 years old, created during the last ice age. At that time, the climate in northern Australia was very different. It was part of a larger landmass called Sahul, connecting Australia and New Guinea. The sea level was much lower. The people who created the Bradshaw art lived in a world we can barely imagine. And then, their culture seems to have vanished. The unique Bradshaw style of painting stops. It is replaced by the styles of art that are clearly linked to the ancestors of the modern Aboriginal peoples. What happened to the Bradshaw people? One compelling theory links their disappearance to a massive environmental change at the end of the Ice Age. As the ice caps melted, the sea level rose dramatically. The coastal plains where these people may have lived were drowned. The climate shifted, becoming the monsoon-dominated weather system of today. This would have completely transformed the landscape, the available resources, and the entire way of life for the people living there. It's possible that the Bradshaw culture could not adapt to this rapid and profound change. They were a casualty of global warming 10,000 years ago. Their society collapsed, and they were either wiped out or absorbed by other groups who were better able to adapt to the new environment. The Bradshaw art is the last remnant of their lost world. Did the Bradshaw people know their world was ending as the seas began to rise? Is there a hidden narrative in their art that tells the story of this climate catastrophe? And could some of the figures in their paintings, which some have interpreted as shamans or sorcerers, represent their desperate attempts to use magic to hold back the encroaching waters? Number 2, who painted the swimmers in the middle of the world's biggest desert? The Sahara Desert is one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. A vast sea of sand and rock under a scorching sun. But it was not always this way. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was green. It was a savanna filled with grasslands, lakes, and rivers, and it was home to people. All across the Sahara, on rock faces and in caves, there is a spectacular collection of prehistoric rock art. This art tells the story of the Green Sahara. The oldest paintings, dating back perhaps 12,000 years, show giraffes, elephants, and crocodiles. They show people hunting and herding cattle. Most surprisingly, in a place called the Cave of Swimmers on the Gilf Kebir Plateau in Egypt, they show people swimming. This art is the only record of the cultures that lived in the Green Sahara. We don't know what they called themselves or what languages they spoke, but we know they thrived there for thousands of years. They were pastoralists, herding cattle across a landscape that is now barren desert. Then, around 5,500 years ago, the climate began to change. A subtle shift in the Earth's orbit changed the pattern of the African monsoon. The rains that had kept the Sahara green began to move south. The lakes dried up. The grasslands turned to sand. The process of desertification was relatively rapid, happening over just a few centuries. The people of the Green Sahara were forced to leave. They could no longer survive in a land that was turning to dust. It was a massive climate-forced migration. Where did they go? It is believed that many of them migrated east towards the one reliable source of water that remained, the Nile River. This influx of people from the dying Sahara may have been one of the key catalysts for the rise of dynastic Egypt. The skills and social structures developed in the Sahara may have provided the foundation for the civilization of the pharaohs. The people of the Green Sahara didn't disappear, but their world did. They became Egyptians or Nubians or other groups, their old identity as people of the savannah erased by the sand. Their art is their only memorial. What was the social structure of these Saharan societies? Were they peaceful herders, or were there complex chiefdoms and kingdoms that we know nothing about? Did they understand that their entire world was drying up, and was their migration a desperate flight or an organized retreat? How much of the founding mythology and religion of ancient Egypt was actually born in the Green Sahara, carried to the Nile by these climate refugees? Number one, what if the first thing we wrote was a shopping list? In ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians built the world's first true cities. Around 4000 BC, in places like Uruk and Ur, they invented a whole host of things we now take for granted: the wheel, the sail, large-scale agriculture, and, most importantly, writing. The Sumerian civilization was a powerhouse of innovation. They built massive ziggurats, developed complex legal codes, and wrote the world's first great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. For over 1,000 years, their culture dominated Mesopotamia. Their language, Sumerian, is a language isolate, meaning it has no known relatives. It is a unique window into the mind of the world's first civilization, but the Sumerians were not destined to last. Starting around 2000 BC, their power began to wane. The region was becoming more saline, the soil exhausted from centuries of irrigation. Their agricultural heartland was becoming less productive. At the same time, Semitic-speaking peoples like the Akkadians and later the Amorites were migrating into the region. These new groups were politically and militarily ascendant. The final blow came when the city of Ur was sacked by invaders around 2004 BC. The Sumerian language was already being replaced by Akkadian as the language of daily life. For a time, Sumerian survived as a classical or religious language, much like Latin in medieval Europe, but eventually it died out completely. The Sumerian people were not wiped out. They were absorbed. Their genes, their culture, and their innovations were all passed on to the Babylonians and Assyrians who came after them. But their unique identity and their language vanished from the world. For thousands of years, they were completely forgotten, their cities buried under mounds of dirt, until archaeologists began to excavate them in the 19th century and decipher their cuneiform script. The disappearance of the Sumerians is the disappearance of the beginning. They were the first to write, the first to build cities, the first to record their laws and stories. But they couldn't write an ending that would save them. They were washed away by the tides of history, of a foundational culture that was ultimately consumed by its own successors. It is the ultimate story of a civilization disappearing not into thin air, but into the very fabric of the civilizations that replaced it. What did the Sumerian language actually sound like? Can we ever truly understand the worldview of a people so ancient whose language is so alien to us? And when the last native speaker of Sumerian died, did anyone notice that a unique way of seeing the world had just been extinguished forever? Was the loss of their culture seen as a tragedy, or was it just the unremarkable, unrecorded price of progress?